thank you all for joining us on this panel, Advancing Diverse Representation in the News. We know that around the world, 24% of the people seen or read about or heard in the news are women, and only 19% of subject matter experts are women. If we've learned anything at all during this past year, during this pandemic, where we've seen the disproportionate impact on women and people of color and the inequities surrounding the pandemic and how it's impacted our communities, it's that we need voices of women and people of color across news media platforms, not only to fight gender and racial inequality, but to improve the business of journalism and news reporting. So that's why we're here today, and we have a wonderful panel of experts to help us understand better how we can advance diverse representation in the news. So I'd love to introduce our panelists, and then we'll get started. These are a brilliant group of ladies, and so I know you'll enjoy the conversation. First of all, I'd like to introduce Nina Goswami. Nina is the BBC's creative diversity lead for their 50-50, the Equality Project and the News. And you're going to hear more about that initiative shortly. She spearheads initiatives to support the corporation's aspiration that its on-air representation will actually reflect our society. Now, Nina is also a journalist. She's returned to the BBC recently over the past year in the midst of the pandemic to serve as a TV output editor and senior producer to support critical news during this coverage. She has worked in the media in her whole professional career, including for the Sunday Times and the Sunday Telegraph. Nina, it's a pleasure to welcome you today.
Thanks for having us.
You're welcome. Next is Kathleen McElroy. Kathleen is the director of the School of Journalism and a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. Now, Kathleen's passion for journalism started as long ago as the 4th grade when she decided to become a sports reporter after eating free food in the Astrodome. How many people can say that in the Astrodome press box? Now, she ended up later editing publications throughout Texas and in New York, including 18 months at what she calls the late great National Sports Daily, and then 20 years at the New York Times. And as I said, she is now director of the University of Texas Austin School of Journalism and Media. So welcome, Kathleen, to our panel. And last but not least, we have Laura Zelenko. She is our senior executive editor for talent, diversity, standards, and training at Bloomberg News. She spent more than 2 decades overseeing business, finance, and markets coverage across the globe for Bloomberg News. And she now serves as the newsroom's global standards editor and head of all training, talent, and diversity initiatives. And now that work focuses on improving representation across every level of Bloomberg and in content on every platform by accelerating initiatives to recruit, retain, and develop top diverse talent in the organization. So ladies, welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
And I really, thank you. Yes, thank you. And I really want to start our conversation and discussion focusing on a couple of themes. I mean, first and foremost, I think we would all agree that a conversation around advancing representation on air cannot be separated from a discussion about diversity behind the scenes. I know that we're going to get into that shortly. And also, as we talk about improving representation and increasing representation, we know that those efforts can't be only focused on recruiting. We know that we have to get at cultural issues within our organizations, and so that we are providing equitable opportunities for advancement. And so those are 2 major areas that are crucial to understand as we talk about advancing representation in the news. And so let's just get started. And I really would love to start with Nina. Let's talk about the power of data in advancing representation. You know, I mentioned briefly in your introduction that you've spearheaded this award-winning BBC 50-50 initiative. And so let's share with our attendees what that initiative is, what it's all about, and how it utilizes data to advance on-air representation.
Great. Oh, well, thank you so much again for having me on this panel. It's brilliant to be here with you all, and to be able to talk about 50/50. So, 50/50. It started as a project that we, as journalists, started in the BBC London newsroom, and it's grown from that. So there was a guy called Ros Atkins, who's the presenter of Outside Source, which is one of our TV news programs, and he was seeing how we at BBC News are always in this constant state of trying to increase women's representation. And that was back in 2016. And, he just got to this point where he went, right, we need to do something about this. He came up with a very simple idea, which is at the heart of 50/50 today. And that is to count the number of men and number of women on our content to see if we can increase the number of women on our content to 50% women's representation. So if you're a daily program, what we're looking at is 50% women's representation over a month period. And so, as I say, we all just did it as a bunch of journalists in the newsroom. And with his team, he found that when they first started, they thought they were going to be actually pretty good when it came to women's representation. And what they found was actually that it was under 40% that, of their content involved women contributors. It took them 4 months to reach 50% women, but using the data every day to identify what their program looked like, and using it as a kind of a auto calculator. So 2 weeks in, they would go, right, we're at now 60% men, 40% women. How do we change that dial? What can we do? Where are the areas where we don't have women representation, where we need to improve that? And so using those techniques, they reached that 50% 4 months later and haven't looked back. And the rest of the BBC saw what they were doing. It started spreading word of mouth. And now just almost 650 teams across the BBC are now taking part, not just in news, but we have content makers from kind of drama, from topical programs, orchestras and music. Anywhere that you can monitor your content, we're doing it. And not just at the BBC, but also with partner organisations as well. Just over 80 now taking part and doing the same thing. So it's really exciting to be able to share that, and to think that it just started from a bunch of journalists always makes me really excited.
Well, that just sounds so wonderful, and it's those grassroots efforts often that have the biggest impact. I just want to understand a little bit better. It sounds like it's a voluntary initiative. Is that right, as opposed to mandatory? And then how does that self-auditing work?
Yeah, absolutely. It's voluntary. And I think the reason why we've left it as voluntary, I say it's voluntary, but a little bit of, management and leadership buy-in is obviously extremely useful. But we keep it voluntary because we want the content makers who are doing the monitoring, because it's the content makers who do it. We want them to feel like they own it, that they have permission to make the change. And so that's why we think it's quite powerful that it's voluntary in its essence. But how do they do the monitoring is a really good question. So it's self-monitoring, as you mentioned. And we have 3 core principles. Use data to affect change. So I've kind of explained that, use the data every day or as soon as you can to understand your program so that you can identify the areas that you can improve. Count what you control, which to me is pretty much one of the most important things, because there's no point counting things that we can't control. And so we use this example just mainly because my background is a TV news bulletin journalist. A half-hour program, and we're talking about something that's politics-based. The British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. I can't control that he is Boris Johnson, and I couldn't control it with Theresa May before him. Right. So we take them out of the count. We don't count them. We count everything that our teams can count. And so they can make change, because they can identify something they control and therefore make that change. And the most important golden rule is that the best contributor always takes part. And the reason why we do that is because, 50% is great, but it has to be equality, and it has to be to enrich our storytelling, because the editorial is paramount over everything that we do.
Well, and basically, it sounds like the commitment is to improving representation and demonstrating that you can reach those goals with the highest quality on-air representation and guests possible at the same time, which is to dispel that, that sort of that myth, oh, I can't find the right people. So that's incredible that you've been able to do that. And is it focused mainly on guests and contributors, or also anchors? Presenters, as you would say, I think.
yeah, we call them presenters. Yeah, absolutely. So it depends on the program. So what we do is we tailor 50-50 depending on your particular content. So for BBC News, we can't control who the presenters are. That's definitely decided by the bosses above our heads. But for current affairs programs, topical programs, we have a program called Country File, where they, as a team, get to choose who are the anchors for those shows every episode. So they do count their presenters. So again, it's that control element that's the most important for us.
Great. Thank you so much. And Laura, I'm very curious to hear about the initiative that you've spearheaded at Bloomberg. It's a New Voices initiative, and it's also focused on increasing representation of women and experts across your platforms. Could you share a little bit about your initiative and how it's similar or different to the 50-50 initiative?
Yes, I'd love to. And I just want to say, I think it's really important to point out that this is a challenge across the media industry. And I've actually often am speaking with other journalists, and Nina and I have had many conversations over the years. And it's really important that we're all pulling our weight. This is not a competitive challenge. One of us isn't trying to beat the other one out, that we really need to make this change across the board. Now, New Voices, in many ways, came from a similar starting point as BBC, where we had been trying and thinking that we were improving representation in our coverage for quite a long time, especially in terms of representation of women. But in early 2018, we decided to actually look at the data, very specifically, to see if we had gotten the kind of momentum that we thought. And when we looked at the data, to the point that Nina made, when we looked at the data, that was what was really surprising. Only 10% of our outside guests on Bloomberg TV globally were women. And we also looked at how often female experts were quoted or cited in stories, and it was less than 10% of our top stories, our front page stories. So despite years of really pushing this, I think we realized we hadn't done enough, and we hadn't been intentional enough, and we hadn't tried to hold our staff accountable. So we focused on three main areas for New Voices. And most of that was to try to get rid of the excuses that they couldn't find the people, that the people didn't exist, or that for some reason it wasn't possible to find female experts to appear on TV or in our stories. We built out a database of female experts that is global. It began with about 500 names and is now over 6,000. And this is a searchable database on the Bloomberg terminal that can look at areas, topics that people can speak to, where they work, what cities, what kind of specialty they have. And again, Bloomberg News is very focused on the financial market. So the more that you can drill down in terms of what someone's expertise is, the better for the reporter looking for the source. We also set up a tracking method so that we could reliably count both how often we are quoting women, female experts in stories, and how often we're bringing them on to TV, every program in every region, every day, and reporting that out. And then the final piece was that we wanted to sponsor media training for female experts around the world, because we were hearing from many of the women that we reach that they didn't feel comfortable going on TV, or that they weren't getting the same level of training that their male colleagues were getting at their firms, or that they just didn't feel like they had the confidence to go on. So we are sponsoring training for female experts in 10 cities around the world. This year we're adding Johannesburg, South Africa as well. And we've already trained more than 250 women, mostly in finance, but in other businesses as well. And this has been something that we can talk about the impact of that, but it's something that our goal isn't just to make it easier for them to appear on Bloomberg TV, but any news outlet. And you'll see many of the people that have gone through our training are now regular guests on Fox Business or CNBC or other outlets, maybe even the BBC. Yeah. And right now, our representation on Bloomberg TV globally is about 27% female experts, so we've almost tripled the representation, still have a long way to go. And we've really pushed up the percentage of stories that quote or cite a female expert to about 18% of our top stories. Again, not where we want it to be, but we're reporting it out and we're able to track that daily.
No, listen, I mean, the point of these kinds of initiatives is to make sure that you're making progress, right? And Laura, you started off by saying that this isn't sort of a competition. We're all trying to reach the same goals, and we will talk more about the impact, how these initiatives can actually impact industries outside of the news media. But I want to bring Kathleen into this conversation because, you know, as the director of your journalism school, you are witnessing firsthand that next generation of journalists. And how do you envision these kinds of initiatives impacting what you're able to do in your journalism school?
Well, first of all, thank you all for having me here, and I apologize for my old school headphones. But, you know, I think both of these programs are fabulous, and I would love to work with Nina and Laura to bring these to not just my J school, but other schools. You know, because of initiatives like this, we'd already started doing this in like puppy steps. For instance, in our beginning reporting class, the students have to outline not only whom they interviewed, but why did you select this person and what did you do to have diverse sources? So we're drilling that into them now in ways that even 5 years ago, I don't think J schools did. We talk about why do the experts have to look a certain way? What makes the typical older white male more expert than someone who isn't? So we're beginning to have these discussions. And, you know, luckily we're seeing this happening in the industry. A lot of our other initiatives are because we don't see it happening in the industry, and we want to help students sort of make that transition from entry-level journalists to moving on up, because we see so many of them dropping out because of a word we've heard here a lot, culture. Well, maybe we haven't heard it here, but we're all thinking about it.
Well, we will hear it here soon. and so let's talk a little bit about the impact of these initiatives and how they're really the gift that keeps on giving to a certain degree. Because they've been launched with the purpose of improving and advancing representation, mainly on air, across platforms of these news organizations. But Nina and Laura, could you speak to the impact they're having on other industries and how they're advancing diversity and inclusion as it relates to other industries? Nina, do you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say, Kathleen, your kind of concept is something that we feed into with 50/50 as well, because we have university J schools on board, because the idea is that we thought that if they're coming into the industry thinking about this immediately, then hopefully that will create the diversification that we're hoping for through the newsroom. So I'm so pleased to hear that that's happening at your J schools. So sorry, going back to the actual question. In terms of external organisations outside the BBC, one example is definitely the universities, and so we partner with about a dozen or so across the globe at the moment. But that's just one element. We're also looking at other organisations, corporate organisations and businesses, because the way that we look at it is that they're the feeders into the media. So if they're identifying the talent within their organisations and putting that forward to us as media organisations, then we're going to be more reflective of society also. So that's why we've been asking organisations to monitor their communications internally. Are they reflecting their workforce properly? What are they doing when they are putting their spokespeople up, whether it be at an event, whether it be to the media? Are you reflecting your organisation properly? Or are you trying to reflect the people that you're trying to attract to your organisation? Because we know, obviously, you can't be what you can't see, as we hear often. And so that's something that could be helpful from that perspective. So the more that we look at the data, we understand our organizations and what we want to achieve an outcome, identify again the gaps, and then take the action to make the difference, and then diversify that way. And I think that's a really powerful thing. And as I say, that's something that we're trying to support through 50/50. I think that really complements some of the work that Laura's doing in her initiatives as well.
Yeah, I think, we really work a lot with the organizations. And I like to say, if you care about representation in your own company, then you have to care about how your company is represented in the media. I mean, one thing does reflect on the other. And I think a couple things that have been really interesting to watch. One is that you start seeing the firms recognizing the importance of getting more diverse executives into positions that they feel comfortable having them speak on behalf of the firm for. So that's going to have a knock-on effect on promotions and on kind of pushing the pipeline further. But you're also seeing the people, the women that have come on TV, and I should say that we've expanded our program to a cohort of Black executives in business and finance of all gender identities, as well as this year Latinx executives of all gender identities in the U.S. And what you're seeing from the folks that have gone through the program and ended up getting on TV regularly is that they're seeing a change in their own careers. I can't tell you how many people come back with stories about getting promotions, changing jobs, realizing that it's impacting their fundraising. In some cases, it's given them more confidence. They've started podcasts. And if you sort of think about it, if you really kind of think about the impact in terms of viewership, I can give one example of one woman who went through our program, was on TV 19 times last year on many different stations, 19 times, 19 shows. Let's say the average viewership is 500,000. Let's say it's 1 million. I mean, it's that many more eyeballs listening to that person. It drives their own careers and their business. And this is something that I think a lot of women that I've talked to didn't make the connection that, media representation is, I can become a newsmaker. We've made many newsmakers over the years of a very sort of similar type of person. And I think now that, that kind of is something that, is catching on. So in some ways it should be obvious, but I think the path wasn't as open to such a diverse group of people in the past. And that's our own fault as journalists. It's the media's own sort of narrow-minded view of things. And I think that the fact that we're intentionally changing that is going to have a big impact on the industries that these people represent.
I mean, really, we've been talking about these on-air diversity initiatives that are impacting behind-the-scenes diversity at industries across the board. And that is so important. And that connection, obviously, between on-air diversity and newsroom diversity is really important. And I want to bring Kathleen into the conversation to discuss that a bit. I mean, you shared some interesting statistics earlier on in one of our prep calls about how the number of women graduating from journalism schools is far greater than their representation in newsrooms. And can you share a little bit about that and why you think that phenomenon is existing and what can be done to turn that tide?
I do want to add one more thing to what Nina and Laura have been talking about. Imagine being a young girl and seeing that female CEO or that female representative talking now. So I think that also sort of lets people see that they can see themselves in other places, what you all were talking about. I just think that's a happy side effect of just having more female and people of color representation. Yeah, journalism schools have, I think it's anywhere from 65 to 75% of the graduates are women, yet the entry-level positions are only about 47 to 50%. Where are they dropping off? And as you move up the corporate ladder, the number of women and people of color and women of color just drops to a trickle. Now, some may say, well, they didn't really want to work in a newsroom. Women didn't want to work in a newsroom, or they want to have a family. I think those are these hegemonic excuses that we have used to justify there being fewer women in newsrooms. that in fact, I think it's the harassment, which now very much includes online harassment of female journalists. I think it's the lack of understanding about things. Yet another thing COVID laid bare, who's taking care of the children? Who's taking care of the parents? Who's taking care of everything? So there are these forces that newsrooms have covered outside of journalism, but rarely pointed the camera at its own practices, at their own practices. So I see that we need to help women and journalists of color see themselves not just get into the newsroom, as we're talking about, not just be that statistic, but to thrive in newsrooms, to be in places where their voices are recognized, and to sort of say, is this a place where I want to be, or am I better off someplace else? So we believe that you can help change the culture of newsrooms by helping young journalists recognize that newsrooms have culture.
Right. And that dissonance that you just spoke to, that happens when employees see their news organizations covering inequality and disparity, gender inequality, racial injustice, yet they don't always feel as if, as you said, that that the cameras turn inward. And it's probably even more challenging from a morale standpoint, because there's that dissonance where, wow, we're doing a great job in our coverage, but are we doing as well behind the scenes? And it's really important to create that culture of retention and development. And Laura, I know that's some of what you're focused on in your role. Do you want to talk about how you are trying to address, not just the on-air representation, but the behind the scenes efforts as well?
Yeah, and I think it really the issue really became incredibly really fell into the spotlight in the past year, because you're having these discussions about how to write a story on inequality, about injustices, and you're sitting on your Zoom and you're looking at who's in the room having the conversation, whose voices are we listening to talk about how to write that story, and it's just so in your face if you don't have good representation. So I like to say that it matters who's reporting the story, who's editing the story, who's deciding where the story plays on what platform, as well as who you're talking to decide what stories to write and how to write them. And that whole discussion, it matters whose voices are being elevated. And so it becomes, even in newsrooms where you don't have the right representation level by level, and it really should be looked at level by level because of this. Even in those newsrooms, it is imperative that the managers bring in a diversity of voices to have that discussion, so that we don't have blind spots in our coverage, so that we don't have bias in our coverage, so that we're not missing the important stories to tell. And I think that has been a big frustration for many people in newsrooms, that particularly where you don't see the kind of representation that we want to have. And but I think that that's a way of getting us closer, is to, at least with the people that we do have in the newsroom, make sure that there is better representation in those story meetings, and that we're thinking more strategically about who's writing what story and who's working with what editor, and just sort of what our mix is in any given piece of work. And it's challenging. It's challenging when you haven't done the recruiting and when you haven't had the retention that you hope to see.
Right. And at the beginning of our conversation, one of the major themes I said I wanted us to hit was what to do with our employees who are already in the organization, because a lot of diversity efforts, to be honest, focus on recruiting. I mean, you think about increasing representation, and so a lot of organizations focus on recruiting. But what we need to realize is that, it's increasing representation as you advance throughout the levels of an organization, which should be as much of a priority. I mean, that's what we see, right? We see the declining numbers as you advance throughout the organization. I mean, at CNN, we're fortunate because we exceed gender parity at all levels, from manager up through VP, but then there's a bit of a gap at the VP and above level, right? We're not quite at 50. We're gonna fill that gap. We're gonna get there, but every other level, we exceed gender parity. And so this culture piece, this piece of creating the culture where employees feel as if their voices are heard is extremely important. And so as we've talked about newsroom diversity and behind the scenes diversity, I want us to really talk more about what you just mentioned, Laura, which is how is that impacting the content? Like Don Lemon wrote this great MLK Day challenge in Politico, which basically, among other things, said that these efforts around diversity and inclusion should no longer be viewed as, doing, people of color a favor or doing women a favor. We've been able to demonstrate that it is impacting our journalism and it's important for the business of journalism. And so I want you to speak to that, especially as we've witnessed over this past year, during this year of racial reckoning. And also, as I mentioned before, also looking at the disparate impact of the effect of the pandemic on working women, right? And the challenges they've had to face in terms of navigating working and family life and taking care of elders and children. And so can you speak to that? What is the connection and the importance to our business to advance representation behind the scenes as it relates to our content? And how can we do better?
I'm going to jump in and just say I think it's a competitive necessity right now. I mean, when I talk about we're not competing over who's getting the best representation, but it is a competitive necessity to stay in business because you're going to miss stories. You're going to tell the stories in a way that's not accurate, and you're going to, and I think that you have the only way to kind of convince a newsroom of the importance of all of this is to focus on the journalism. Our journalism will be better if we do this right. One thing that we've done at Bloomberg this year was we always had a team that looked at diversity issues within business, but we basically this year we expanded what we're calling our equality task force. And the message was that we should be writing about these themes on every beat. It can't be a standalone beat. This has to be something that is infused in our thinking as we're thinking about what are the most important stories to tell. If you're doing that while you're trying to continue to build level by level the right representation and diversify your sourcing, I mean, hopefully at that point, what comes out is going to be better journalism. And we haven't cracked the nut for sure, but I think pointing people in that direction is extremely important for the cause of staying in business, as an important media organization.
No, I'd talk to Laura's point there as well, most definitely. So one of the things that we've seen through 50/50 is that, with our teams, so if we look at the figures from our last report, 2/3 of our teams reached 50% women compared to when they first started, which was just over 1/3. But the audience impact was what was really, really interesting from that last report. So we saw that for 16 to 24-year-olds, they were enjoying content more because of an increase in women's representation. We saw that 32% more of women aged 25 to 34 were consuming more content as a result of increased women's representation. So if you want a business case as to why representation is important, that is it right there. And the other side of that story, I always use an example of our Vietnamese service, BBC Viet. When they started 50/50, they were at less than 20% women representation. And they were like, there's no way we'll be able to get to 50% women. Within 3 months, there were 80% women, 80% women representation. Why? Because they started looking for different types of story and they uncovered a world of stories that they had no idea about. We've had to dial them back, obviously, to 50/50. But that's the power of diversity and representation and content. And that BBC Viet example, they did their trainee scheme application forms, and they had a young girl who got in touch. I think she was too young to actually apply, but anyway, who said that the reason that she decided to apply was because she'd seen an increase in women on their services and wanted to know why. Found out about the 50/50 project and wanted to work for an organisation that champions women. So there you go. That's an example of the power of what we're doing together.
Well, yes.
No, I was just going to say quickly that all of this to me gets into the whole idea of a newsroom as a workplace. You create a better workplace, you create a better product. And we've been working with the Press Forward for those reasons, because if you see harassment, sexual harassment, you see diversity issues, you see a lot of this stuff can be put under the umbrella of a lack of management in newsrooms. So that's why I think we're all talking about seeing journalism as a thriving business, which it can be because of diversity and inclusion and equity, or whichever order you want to put those words in.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just so drawn to what you said, right? It's a workplace, and a lot of journalists aren't necessarily managers by nature, right? And so, but journalists are the ones who ascend through the ranks. And so in terms of the skills they need to understand how to create this workplace culture that will tap into the potential of all of our employees is really important. And Kathleen, I know you're working on a project relating to trying to get this transformation of newsrooms so that they do become more inclusive and ethical cultures that support the staff, but also produce that multi-dimensional and authentic content that our readers and viewers can relate to. Do you want to share a little bit more about that?
Sure. And, this is how I met Laura, and I'm so happy to meet Nina this way. It's the Press Forward, which I mentioned, and it's run by Carolyn McGordy-Supple, who is a co-founder and executive director. The main thing is that we're going to be creating an open source national curriculum on ethical newsroom leadership. And it's not really just about leaders. It's about creating staffers who feel as if their voices matter, that they can thrive in newsrooms, and what they can do about harassment and what they can do about this. Many of us became accidental managers, and no one really gave us a book, or maybe they gave us a book and said, here, go lead people. You're a really good editor, you're a really good writer, you're a really good producer, and all of a sudden you're a manager. So what we're trying to do is, at least from the point of view of J schools, and by the way, this will be open to any media outlet, is that to have training on teamwork, on hearing the voices of your employees, on hiring practices. So it's just something, and I'm looking forward to working with all of you on this too.
Great. No, this is exciting, and we're all looking forward to hearing more about it as well. And so I know we're going to have to wrap up soon, but there are two final things I want us to address, and all of you don't have to speak to each thing, but I want us to talk about how we can amplify the voices of women and people of color who are already in our organizations, because as we know, exposure is extremely important to advancement. And when we do have people of color and women in the organization, we also know that they're not always given the same opportunities, or they're not always allotted the same kind of exposure. And so in those editorial discussions, in those meetings, what can we do to really augment their voices?
I mean, I think part of it is managers need to be conscious and aware of who they are giving the primo assignments to and why, and to really think about that, and to shake it up a bit, and to try other people out, and to give people the exposure to the stories that are going to be the most visible. That's one thing, I think. And we notice this a lot when we get to the awards, the moment of like, who are we nominating for awards? And if you start seeing the same people over and over again, there should be a question of whether, is it just because they're the best, or is it because we haven't given the opportunities to a wider range of people? So that's one way. And I think this whole issue of the story discussion meetings, every media organization does this in different ways, but there tends to be, if we only keep maybe senior managers in those meetings, we're already missing out on a whole lot of great ideas. So that, that alone is an important thing to diversify. But you want to make sure that you're looking in terms of gender, that you're looking in terms of race and ethnicity, that you're bringing different perspectives into the room when you're talking about your daily coverage, so that you're not missing out on important ideas. And I think both of those things are you can do tomorrow. You could do today. This is not, this doesn't take a lot of training to do that. That's something that should just be baked into the workflow.
I'm going to say three things: sponsorship, allyship, championship. That is what every manager should be doing for everyone that they identify talent in.
And to add on to that, this has been great. Go ahead, Jonah. This has been wonderful.
No. I don't want to listen. I defer to you guys. You are the queens here. This is amazing. And I am going to try and steal a little bit more of your time and just have you go around. And I know you've already discussed this a bit in your conversation, but what would you say the number one priority should be to advance representation in the news? That's my last question for each of you.
Well, what I was going to say to follow up what Nina was saying, I think managers need to get out of their comfort zone. And they can do that by allowing staffers to have a comfort zone, and that by paying attention to them. So it's not about trying to make one side have more of one or the other, but to realize that your staffer might be going through different things than you are, and your staffer has a lot to offer beyond what's ever on a sheet of paper or a resume.
I mean, I would say for me, it would be data. Don't be afraid of data. Use it as a tool to identify where you can make positive change.
Okay, I'm gonna kind of jump off the back of that, which is I think transparency and accountability is absolutely key to actually making progress. I mean, we can talk about a lot of different things, but as I think both the BBC and our example shows, is that if you're not being intentional and actually taking a hard look at where you are, you're not going to get further. You're not going to make progress. So I do think transparency in your numbers and accountability for change is super important.
Oh, and if I could add one more thing.
Yes.
Diversity.
Yes,
I'm so sorry. Diversity is not the problem, issue, thing to be solved by people of color and women, right? Don't put it on their back. It's not their problem. So, and I think too often that's what happens. We've hired you, so there.
That is so important. That is extremely important. And for those of us in the industry, the practitioners here on the panel, I know you all are agreeing with that. And I just want to end by thanking all of you, not just for your time today, but for all of your efforts, not just in your companies and not just in our news industry, but in industries across the board. We've seen how what you're doing is impacting women and people of color in all industries, and that's extremely rewarding and important. And so we can't thank you enough for that. And we've learned so much from you. I'm sorry I was not able to take notes because I didn't want to be looking down the entire time. But believe me, it's all in my head. And so and I know that it's resonated for all of our attendees and listeners. So thank you for your time, and we're going to keep on keeping on with this, right? Onward and upward. So thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.